Welcome back to another episode of the ECOMsquare Overshare. And today we're going to be diving under the hood of the websites that you may be running for your e-commerce store and talking about web performance. And to help us do that, I am super happy to be joined by Shawn O'Neill. He is the founder of SpeedSense and also an ECOMsquare co-working member, I might add. So part of the community coming in here to help us out. So yeah, welcome, Shawn. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, it's exciting to be here. It's good to chat about nerdy web performance stuff anytime.
Cool. So when we talk about site performance, what do you mean when you say site performance? What is that? And why is it important?
Great question. Yeah. That's funny because that's often where the conversation begins. Like somewhere in a company or in an e-commerce company, or it could be any company, honestly, but we're going to talk about e-commerce today. So somewhere someone says, hey, our website is slow, it should be fast. And then what is fast, right? We need to define what a performant website is, how fast it ought to be. And if you don't know how fast it is and how fast you need to be, then that is a nebulous question. Mm-hmm. We help brands run a faster website because a faster website is highly correlated with user satisfaction and revenue and traffic and bounce rates and a lot of other really important metrics to running a store.
Okay, so you're talking mostly about speed. When we're talking about site performance, we're talking about speed. So is that speed measured qualitatively or quantitatively? When you say a site is not performing well enough, do we mean we're on the site and we can feel the lag? Or there's a metric, and if you're not hitting a certain number, then you're not fast enough?
So the first way to answer that question is let's define what fast is. There's 100 different metrics you could use across a dozen different tools, and then you probably have 1,000 pages on your website. And that combination of data is just way too much to manage. So we've sort of boiled it down into a few categories of metrics. So we can talk about, we'll say rendering. Does it look fast? And then interactivity, does it feel fast? When I click on something, is there lag? And then if I go to a web page, am I staring at a white screen for 5-10 seconds before I see anything? And so those two, in combination with a few other metrics, really represent the user experience of performance. It doesn't really matter how many milliseconds it takes to build the page on your server. It doesn't really matter how long your database calls are, until those things start to impact the user experience. So our approach is really around, it's modeled after how Google is also representing this data. We want to build a performance site, defining performance from the user's perspective. So a good experience in Google's mind leads to a better search result. And so they prioritize performant pages. But also there's 100 different metrics that are affected by site speed, right? Like all the way from your return on ad spend, because your bounce rate is highly affected by performance. Imagine a brand spending, $100,000 to run a Black Friday, not to date the podcast too much, but this week, Black Friday. Yeah. So a lot of brands are spending millions just to drive eyeballs. And if it takes 5 seconds for them to see anything and they're staring at a white screen or a spinning pinwheel, then you've lost a lot of traffic there. And there's a big opportunity right at the top of the funnel for site speed to make an improvement in your bottom line. And then all the way through the funnel, of course, you're minimizing abandonment at every step.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think everyone's had that experience where, especially on your phone, maybe you're like, oh, that looks cool. You click on it and then you're waiting. Oh, the coffee's ready. All right, I'll get back to it later. And then you never do, and that's gone.
Totally. Yeah. And it's it looks bad on the brand. It's part of the user's or the customer's perception of your brand. Mm-hmm. If you're trying to buy anything, right? Like just our attention, I have this conversation a lot about how fast should it be? And it falls into two categories, right? One, if you're selling a computer mouse, you could buy that anywhere. And so you need to be as fast as the other brands that are selling that thing. Whereas if you're selling Teslas, where else are you going to buy a Tesla besides their website? And
right.
There's likely not as strong a correlation, that we haven't done, Tesla's not a client of ours, but we haven't modeled the correlation for them between site speed and revenue. We've done it for other brands. So, you need to be as fast as the expectation for the thing that your customer is buying. But then on the other hand, our expectation of performance is set by literally every digital touch point. So if I hit the Netflix button on my remote control, I expect it to boot in a certain amount of time. If I'm on YouTube and I hit play, I expect it to be playing in a certain amount of time. And so every time we touch glass, we expect a response in a given time, regardless of the subject matter. So there's kind of two categories there. Like, you definitely want to be as fast as or faster than your e-commerce competitors, because someone could get the solution elsewhere, but also cognizant that, if all your competitors are really slow, that doesn't mean you're allowed to be really slow.
Right. Yeah. I always think with e-commerce stores, it might be easier to understand if you use the corollary of the brick and mortar, where I think sometimes people are maybe comfortable of like, oh, we just slapped up this site and it works and that's enough. But if you were opening up a store in a mall, you're not throwing up like a cardboard table, right? Like, because it's so true. It's like everyone goes in, especially now, everyone's so used to digital interaction that everything they see is going to be a reflection of your brand. So if your site is not quality, then they're just going to assume that you're not quality and the product's not quality, and it's all
the bar's high.
Yeah, I can definitely see that. So I did want to get back to because you mentioned how Google is going to prioritize you if you have a site that performs well. I'm assuming you're not comparing just on like vibes. You're not like opening up two windows and just seeing what happens. Like how do you compare between, maybe your competitors? How do you quantify where your site is at compared to other people?
Great question. The easiest way for anyone to go and do this, and also, well, I'll start with the data set. Where is this data coming from? And Google needs some mechanism. If they're going to say faster equals better ranking, they need some mechanism for quantifying fast. And so they happen to also build a browser, Chrome. And every time you're using Chrome, browsing the web, it's phoning home back to Google services saying this page took this many milliseconds to draw the first element, to draw the most important element, like the hero image. When somebody hit the screen, it took 400 milliseconds before the CPU was able to respond to that input. And so they're building this huge database of RUM data, real user monitoring data, for the performance of every page. And then that gets aggregated into performance of your whole domain. So some pages may get a lot more traffic than others. Some are going to inevitably faster than others. There's always faster and slower pages on a site. And then they use that to rank SEO partially. You know how SEO is, and this isn't really necessarily just an SEO play, but it's one factor. So that data set is called Crux, the Chrome User Experience Report.
Okay.
And it's publicly accessible. If you go to pagespeed.web.dev and type in your domain, you can run a scan that does two separate things. One is it'll look up the data in the Crux database and say, for all the users that are browsing your page, this is how many milliseconds it takes to do all these things. And they'll give you like a green, red, yellow distribution of speed. If you wanted to put in your website into pagespeed.web.dev and 3 or 4 of your competitors' websites, you'll see that distribution of whether you're passing or failing what they call the core web vitals metrics. So Crux data backs this core web vitals experience, and that's really what they're saying is a signal for a good UX and therefore a good search result.
And I have done that before and looked at those type of reports, and there's a ton of metrics, right?
Totally.
There's a bunch. Are they all equally important when you're looking at that type of report, or are there a couple that sort of really stand out as like these are the key ones that are really going to affect both the user experience of your site's performance and also maybe the Google ranking of your site?
Great question. Google over the years has come up with these metrics they call the core web vitals that I talked about a second ago. And that is through tons of research around what matters to the user. So what matters to Google as best they can at this point is what matters to the user. And so the top 3 metrics there fall into these categories of rendering and interactivity that I talked about a second ago. So the first, we'll say, is a rendering metric. It's called largest contentful paint. And this is the time at which your hero element renders. So if it's like the biggest image on your homepage, your product tile, product shot on your PDP. When did that get drawn to the screen? Because that is the most relevant, based on pixel size, the most relevant piece of information on the screen. It might be text if it's a blog post. It might be a video if it's video. So LCP, largest contentful paint, that's the most important rendering metric, and it influences SEO rank. The next would be something to represent this interactivity. So when I hit the screen, how long does it take until I get a response? And the metric right now that they're using to represent that is called first input delay. So how many milliseconds from the first time a user touches the screen until the CPU is able to process that input. This one, you want to aim for under 100 milliseconds is the target, so that an interaction feels instantaneous. After that, our perception of cause and effect sort of breaks down a little, where, I hit that, and then now, if it's a second later, it doesn't feel instant. And then the third metric in the Core Web Vitals set is called cumulative layout shift. And we've all experienced this, imagining like you're trying to add something to your cart and you're halfway down the product detail page, and then a header loads at the top or something, or like a promotion, and it pushes everything down by 100 pixels, and then you hit the wrong button. Worst case is when it's like, you're trying to hit save and you hit delete or something like that. Like this can be really jarring to the UX. And so stability of the layout is the other big criteria for ranking. It's less around speed, but it's affected by speed, because how quickly you get these elements on the screen and whether you've reserved the appropriate space for them when they do arrive is how you influence that. And ideally you want zero layout shift. They'll allow you to have a little, but it's a weird metric. It's not a milliseconds metric. It's like a percentage of the viewport.
Right. Yeah. And then if we can dive in a little bit deeper, what are maybe, if we look at each one of those ones, so the first contentful paint, the layout shift, and the input speed.
Good job.
Okay, we'll have to butcher the actual terminology,
it's
but
fine,
the concepts,
man, you got it.
I got. Okay, so if
does
we
it
start
look
with
fast, does it feel fast?
Exactly. So if we start with that first load, the first image, that first paint, how do you affect that? If you see that your number's low for that, what should someone do?
Sure. Some best practices, or like we'll say heavy offenders on delaying your rendering in general, would be, well, let's start with like anything that blocks rendering. And sometimes A/B testing is a big challenge for this, because the point of A/B testing is you want to, we have the page as is, want to run a variant of it, some kind of manipulate it in some way, and then serve both options to the users and see which one performs better. I mean, I didn't need to explain A/B testing to your audience, I'm sure, but in that phase of manipulating the experience to render the variant, often we don't want the user to see the baseline variant that gets transformed into the challenger. And so a lot of tools will block rendering anything, just like keep the screen purely white, build the page and DOM in the background, manipulate it as needed, and then reveal, like lift the curtain and show the fully rendered page. But sometimes that can add 3 or 4 seconds of delay, depending on how it's implemented, depending on the user's network and device and things like that. And that is for sure one of the worst or most challenging things to do is an experimentation program in a performant way. There are ways around it. We're not going to get into that today. That's a bit in the weeds.
Okay. Yeah, it's something I've seen. Yeah, people might have run a Google experiment, and then you're putting in the anti-flicker snippet, which I'm assuming is totally what you're talking about. Yep. Yeah. So if you don't have that snippet in, if people are curious, so if you have your two alternatives, if you don't have that anti-flicker snippet in, your page, it'll load sometimes the original, and then it switches to the variant, so the user gets kind of a weird experience. So you put in that anti-flicker snippet from Google, and then it does exactly what Shawn just said, where it just delays it. It'll slow it down a little bit, but then the first thing they see will be either the original or the variant. But yeah, obviously you're sacrificing speed there for that.
Yep. And sometimes that's necessary, right? Sometimes we need to learn what's the best experiment. The big problem is when a variant wins and then people just set it to 100% and say, all right, we're done. Instead of the real win there is turn off your A/B testing platform once your hypothesis has been validated, and reintegrate those findings into your base template so that you're not continuing to impact site speed. Like right now, honestly, again, we're talking Black Friday. Now is a great time to not be experimenting, because you've got a good, you know what's best. You spent all year getting ready for this. Turn off your experimentation platform now. Turn off your click tracking. Like all of these little things are going to slow down the experience. Just deliver the best, put your best foot forward for this weekend, and sort of pause your data collection and research. Sorry,
Yeah,
not pause all
100%.
data collection. I don't want to.
No, yeah. But we talked, one of our earlier episodes was with Rob Fraser, who's the CEO of Outweigh Socks. And he comes from a sports background. And what he was talking about was he was talking more about burnout, but he was talking about pacing his year towards certain peak moments,
Totally.
like Black Friday. And I think it's a similar concept where you consider Black Friday, that's sort of the World Cup final of your ecom store. So that's not a time to, try out a new tactic
Strategy.
or try to test something out, throw in the kid off the bench. That's the time where you know what your best team is, and you gotta go with that team. Yeah.
Oh, I love that analogy. Yeah.
It makes
That's
sense.
throwing rookies out there in like Game 7.
Yeah, exactly.
Sorry, there's
exactly.
probably no Game 7 of the World Cup. I'm not a soccer guy. The fact that I call it soccer is probably my tell.
Yeah, that's your first mistake. Yeah.
So I can keep going on this for a second. There's a couple of other quick wins, I guess, on not delaying your largest contentful paint element. Yep. Part of loading a web page is, there's maybe 100 files to download. Your server delivers the HTML file. It has CSS and JavaScript and images and videos, a bunch of stuff embedded in there. And as far as the browser is concerned, more or less all of these are equal priority by default. And so it's going to just get all 100 of these things. And a lot of those are going to be like way below the fold, like stuff that's in your footer. You might have, a reviews widget halfway down the page, or like Trustpilot, or 100 different things, right? And so we can tell the browser with these things called priority hints or preloading, which image ought to be loaded first. And so you can load that before it's encountered in the DOM, so that it's one of the first requests that the browser makes. And then by the time it is encountered in the DOM, it's already in memory and it can get rendered right away. So that's a quick win. Sometimes easier said than done. And this is a good caveat into my next point, I guess, is a challenging way to render quickly is using JavaScript for rendering. So a ton of new sites, new stacks, React, Next, and Angular, not so new anymore, but use JavaScript to render the on-screen experience, as opposed to a base HTML file that renders, that's served from the server. Anytime you're doing that, the browser can't render anything until it has downloaded the JavaScript, executed it, and basically booted the application that represents your store. And then it can start inserting DOM nodes about, this is your image, and then make the request for the image. So that can add a couple of seconds of lag as well in your paint times. And the fastest way to do that is not to render via JavaScript, or pre-render your templates on the server so that you're serving base HTML.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I know, like, I'm not a coder at all, but I do know, again, speaking to the Shopify crowd, that another quick win for your site speed is related to JavaScript. It's your Shopify apps, where I think it's very tempting to, there's so many apps, right? And you're like trying them out. Oh, that's cool. Oh, that doesn't quite work. And then a lot of times you see with people that I've worked with, they sort of have like 20 apps, right? And they're using 5 of them, but and the other ones are free, so they're just sitting there. But that is one very easy, very non-technical way that if you're not using an app, get it out, because it's what Shawn's talking about with everyone is its own piece of JavaScript, and it all has to load, and it takes forever.
Yeah, there's 2 base bottlenecks here. Like, a browser is generally single-threaded when dealing with loading a page in the initial part of it, and your network is a bottleneck. So there's your CPU and the network, and more code hurts both of those. So load fewer things will result in a faster website. But you're totally right, and your talk of plugins and apps reminds me of this World Cup philosophy, right? Like, put your best foot forward, turn off the stuff that's not needed that day, and then if you want to find a new third-party Instagram plugin, like, let's talk about that in January, February, when you've got time to experiment and improve the experience slowly.
Moving from the first paint to the first input, is it a similar, is there any specific, anything different about that where that you're looking at to improve that?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Less about the order in which elements are loaded and more about, well, I guess we'll talk about that 100 files again, right? And I'd said we'll prioritize the most important one. There are also things that will be loaded in that initial load that are not necessary to rendering the above the fold experience or even allowing interaction with the above the fold experience. So some of those elements above the fold are going to require, or in general, anywhere on the page, are going to require JavaScript to handle the input and provide a response. But if you've got elements that are buried pretty far down, or plugins or widgets or anything that's 5 or 6 viewports lower, we can do what's called deferring JavaScript. So there's a couple different ways to load JavaScript. You've probably heard of asynchronous. There's just a straight vanilla load the script, and then there's something called deferring. So when you load a script asynchronously, which was popular for many years, you are telling the browser to fetch it without stopping rendering the DOM. But once it's finished fetching it, it will still process that script and run whatever it contains. And that will be interrupting rendering. So imagining, for example, let's talk about two use cases here. So there's your base analytics script, say it's Google Analytics or something like that. And then, I don't know, what kind of plugin do we want to talk about here? Let's say third-party reviews. Reviews is good.
Yeah.
Certain data is more critical than other data. Not all data is equal.
Yeah.
We need to know when people are landing on our site and when they're bouncing. And if you wait 3 or 4 seconds to capture whether someone has even arrived, then it's going to look like your bounce rates are really healthy. And it's also going to look like your traffic is lower than it is. You have this like invisible period here where people have landed on the site, they may have seen something, but if you defer your analytics script, you're going to miss this bounce rate. And it's important to have that data. And so I wouldn't say defer analytics, but for example, that third-party reviews widget is probably not rendered above the fold. If it is, there's creative ways to go about it, but that's the kind of thing that I would defer the execution. Sorry, I started to talk there about async versus defer and didn't quite finish. So async will load the script asynchronously, but then stop what it's doing basically to execute it. With defer, it'll still load the script asynchronously, but it won't do anything with it until the CPU is ready. So it'll sort of defer the execution of that until, listen, I'm in the middle of building the page right here. Give me a second and then I'll get to that. It's just another way of telling it this is more or less urgent than other assets. And deferring the execution of your third-party assets that aren't critical to rendering is great for first input delay.
Interesting. So I think like conceptually, this is very easy to understand, right? Where you want to load, your important visuals, your important touch points or call to actions first, and you want the other stuff to happen afterwards. For the typical store owner, is this an accessible skill? Is this something that they could accomplish with some Google research, or is this like a highly technical pursuit?
Yeah, great question. I think I'd break down the size of business into maybe 3 categories. There's like mom and pop that do under $1 million a year. There's Best Buy, Amazon, the behemoths that do over $1 billion a year. And then there's sort of everybody in between. Yeah. And so at the very early stages, if you're doing 50K a month, awesome, keep it up. Investing heavily in site performance likely isn't your biggest next step. You probably need to work on product market fit, maybe your offering, maybe just the UX in general. And in between there, the 1 million to 1 billion, which I know is a massive range, and this is obviously going to break down some more. There's a couple of different categories of how you can address performance. There are plugins, there's consultants, there's whether or not you have an in-house development team or an agency that you have on record to help you implement some of these changes. But I think from the mom and pop perspective, if your site is passing Core Web Vitals, first of all, then you don't need to do anything. I would say you're good. Look elsewhere. But starting from a theme or a base set of templates that is performance makes a big difference. We're currently, so this is sort of like maybe an overshare. No, we're currently rebuilding SpeedSense ecomsquare.com, our own website, because it's hilariously it's slow.
Yeah,
And so
it's
we
typical.
recognized,
It's normal. I'm not even surprised that like a performance consultant website isn't that fast, because it's, if you look at almost every like marketing agency website,
mm,
not great marketing. It's like the last.
yeah,
It's always the last thing that you're gonna do. Anyway, sorry to
yeah,
interrupt, but yeah.
yeah. So we're rebuilding our site, and part of that was picking a base template, and part of that was running it through this pagespeed.web.dev for the base template. Usually, if you're looking for a template or a theme, it'll have a demo version, and you can run some tests on it and see, how fast does it load? Is it using JS to render? Is it rendering HTML straight from the server? And so honestly, that's the biggest first step, is start with something fast. Don't start with something where you're going to have to be undoing a bunch of not best practices, or implementing a bunch of best practices that weren't built in the base. Yeah, for mom and pop, in the interim, disable anything you're not using, like you just said, first of all.
Mm-hmm.
And we take that for granted, right? Like, it doesn't really matter, it's still running, but we're not using it. Man, that's every business has something like that in some way.
Mm-hmm.
But it is affecting, all the way from the dollars you spend on ads, how many of those dollars convert into actual eyeballs versus just bounce, and there you're flushing cash right down the drain. And then of those people, this isn't something where if the website is instantaneous, we're going to have 100% conversion rate. Like, never are you going to magically convince people to buy because your website was so fast. But you want to minimize opportunities for frustration. And these are like micro frustrations. That's kind of how brand perception works, right? Like, it's 100 or 1,000 different touch points throughout your whole lifetime. And you don't want slow performance to be impacting that in any way.
Yeah, certainly. It's like a key infrastructure. It's like having a closed store with no change room.
Or it's more like having a closed store that smells. Like, every
Okay,
time you go
yeah.
in there, you can't really put your finger on it, but I just don't like it, right?
Yeah, right. So actually, you know what? We dropped a thread, which is that we were talking about those first three most important things that people can look to affect. And we talked a little bit about the first paint, and we talked about the first input and some of the ways that people can affect that. We missed out the content shift. So what might cause that content shift? I mean, I know what causes that content shift. So basically, it's like there's a spot for an image, and before it's loaded, it's 0 pixels, and then all of a sudden it's 1,000 pixels, and then everything has to shift down, right? So is that the only way that would happen, or is there other ways, that other than like an element that just has a spot that's 0 pixels, then the element comes in and then it takes up the space that it does?
Yeah. That is generally how this happens. An
Mm-hmm.
element loads that is a different size than was reserved for it, and everything is pushed down. I think the most common pattern that is somewhat avoidable is like we want to get the user's attention, and we want to like promote something, right? Like a Black Friday sale, we'll say. And so a lot of times there'll be like a little header that plops down from the top that's,
Mm-hmm.
this week only 50% off or whatever. There's two ways you could do that, right? You could overlay it on whatever else is there and hide whatever's behind it, or you could squish everything else down. And the latter is the worst offender for CLS, for layout shift, because you're moving literally every other element on the page.
Mm-hmm.
So layout shift is calculated by how many pixels moved and by how many pixels did they move.
Mm-hmm.
So even something like a font loading that changes the shape of the letters will affect CLS, but this is why there's some allowable amount, because it's unavoidable in some cases to have a little bit. But the fewer elements you can move, the better. So if you do a promotion at the top of the page that pushes everything down, like, keep space there for that and make it sort of evergreen.
Yeah. How would you do that? How would you keep the space there?
With CSS, you're just going to target the element that it's going to be injected into. So say it's like header, top nav, whatever it's called, and then give it a min height. And then when that element does load, give it a min height that is the height of the final element that's rendered. And then when it does load, it won't be moving anything else below it.
Yeah, totally. And if someone is using like a page builder, like a Shogun, for example, you can do that same thing. A lot of times those page builders will have like a settings dashboard for each element, where you can do exactly what Shawn just said, just set the minimum height for whatever is going to go in there, and then you won't get that shift.
Mhm. Or avoid loading it late in general. I guess a lot of reason this is often a problem is promotion engines that are bolted on.
Hmm.
So a plugin or an add-on or an app that enables this functionality for you. If ever you can build it into the base template, that's going to be more performant.
Mm. So we talked about how a website or a store owner might be able to look at their site and compare it to other people with metrics. We talked about, three key metrics they could look to focus on, some ways they might, improve those metrics for themselves. And everything we talked about was sort of applied to every website. Is there anything about a e-commerce store in particular that presents like its own unique challenges to site performance?
Great question. Yes, certainly. I'll use like a blog as the counterexample, or as the alternative. There's imagine actually a spectrum here of a blog on one end, a ticketing website, Ticketmaster on the other, and e-commerce is sort of right in the middle. For a blog, nothing ever changes. I mean, you write new posts and you get comments and things like that, but once you've written a post, it doesn't need to check on anything in the database to serve that page to the next user. It's very static.
Mm-hmm.
The other end of the spectrum for tickets, you've got every single request is competing with every other request for inventory. And so you need to be continuously checking the database, the backend, the server to see, are there any tickets left? What seats are sold out, etc. And e-commerce kind of falls right in the middle, where some elements are relatively long lasting. Like you've got your homepage doesn't change super often. It changes, every couple of days, maybe. Even that isn't very often in terms of software.
Mm-hmm.
But then at the other end of the spectrum, you've got orders and inventory and user data, that all of that is changing on the fly. So some pages on your site are going to be a lot easier to make very performant than others. And a general rule of thumb is like the deeper you get in the shopping funnel, the less cacheable content is, or like the more dynamic it is, the less static it is.
Right.
Because at the homepage, on a landing page, everybody's sort of getting the same experience, short of doing things like personalization and experimentation.
Mm-hmm.
But then as you go, your listing page, you've got to make sure is up to date with inventory. So that's got to be fresh. The product detail page is even more important, that you can't add something to your cart that's sold out. The cart is even more important because that's specific to the user and specific to their account. And then, on and on and on down the flow to once you hit buy, you've got to do, credit card processing, address validation, reserving the inventory in your product, your order management system. So yes, e-commerce challenges are due to the dynamic nature of the data that powers the website. And that sort of applies agnostic of whether you are in e-commerce or not, because tickets, same idea, right? I mean, I guess tickets are e-commerce, though. You're selling the thing. It's just that your inventory is changing instantly and continuously.
Yeah. Speaking a little bit about SpeedSense, would a service like yours be one that fits well with someone who has like a Shopify store, or is it really only worth it to sort of go to this sort of expert consultancy if you are beyond Shopify, where you sort of have a custom a headless build maybe, or something like that?
Cool question. Yeah, we've served a variety of clients, and there's some huge brands running on Shopify. And Shopify has evolved such that, you could have a headless Shopify store that's completely custom built with an in-house team. So we do a couple of different things. We will help smaller brands with auditing the site, identifying the top opportunities based on their traffic, based on, it's challenging to make a business case for performance when, like I started with, you don't necessarily know how fast you are, how fast you need to be, how fast your competitors are. So we help identify all that, agnostic of how big you are. And then there will be, presuming you can make some changes via some method. So maybe this business has an agency, development shop that they work with, or an outsourced freelance developer or someone. There's inevitably a way you can move the needle. And so we can help. You've got 100 pages, maybe you've got 1,000 pages, and there's 100 different metrics. Where do you begin? And so we can aggregate that into a site speed audit, we call it, which is really agnostic of size. Outside of that, we do like a 90-day sprint, which is coaching the development teams. Typically this is in-house, but it works really well with an agency as well because the agency gets upskilled. But yeah, the idea is empower the team to be able to manage performance on their own, identify issues on their own. We provide tooling for tracking and for identifying opportunities, but that typically suits businesses that have an in-house dev team. They may still be on Shopify. Like there's no reason they wouldn't be able to action these changes on that stack. I would say stack is less a factor, though. As you get up into $2 and $3 and $500 million a year in revenue, they've likely been around for a decade. They've likely got a hodgepodge of services that come together to build the experience. And so the problem is often more complex when you've got a decade of tech debt, as opposed to, this team made our theme for us and it's running, and we've got some apps plugged in. That only grows with scale, right? And you've got a whole different set of devs built the site than are currently maintaining it.
Yeah, a good example for people is probably Twitter. What's happening right now with Twitter, where you see that from what the reports are, it's sort of like it's been around for a while and everything is kind of running. It's a lot more delicate than maybe you'd expect. And like you said, there's been solutions on top of solutions and different devs, and it's sort of, I think like my sort of assumption is that like a company like that, it's such a big company, everything is going to be so tight, right? But then it's really not that way, I guess.
Well, there are brands like Netflix historically has had a great culture around performance because like delivering video is one of the most complex challenges. The payloads are huge, the network constraints are the same. And so at the high end, and I think probably Twitter 6 months ago was a different culture than it is now. But there's often like site reliability engineering teams. They would have, someone responsible for front end performance, for back end performance, an analyst to tie the ROI of performance to user engagement and revenue. An SEO person who's performance centric, maybe a marketing person who manages the assets and the landing pages that's performance centric. And so for teams like, Best Buy, Amazon, Walmart, they've got a multi-million-dollar in-house team dedicated to making it fast and keeping it fast across everything. That's not feasible to spin up for even the $100 million brands, right? Like you hire one developer and say, okay, make the website fast. They don't have the whole skill set. You need a cross-functional department. Right. And we deliver a slice of that, sort of. That's where the value is.
Right. Yeah. So I could see that would be great for people. So then if they wanted to do that, they could visit speedsense.com. Yeah, I assume they get in touch with you, and then you can start with that audit anyway, so they know where they stand and then maybe move from there.
Totally. Yep. Speedsense.com. It's being overhauled right now.
Nice. Yeah, we'll link that below wherever you're watching or listening to this podcast. So yeah, that was amazing. I mean, it's just really, it's always cool to talk to someone who's like an expert in almost any field. And yeah, this was no exception. So it's really interesting to see sort of what's going on behind the screen there. So I wanted to switch gears a little bit because, like I mentioned at the beginning, Shawn is one of, I would say, the founding members of ECOMsquare, one of the very first that came in through the door. So I did want to ask you a little bit about sort of your time and experience there, and how you, maybe like why you decided to try it out in the first place as a co-working space, and sort of what you've made of it so far, what your experience has been like.
Cool. Yeah, great. My relationship with co-working extends back, almost a decade, 2013 or so. Before WeWork, before it was hot, before remote work was really the de facto. And so early in my time working in a space, so I grew up in Newfoundland and I moved out to Vancouver in 2010, sorry. And I started working at a co-working spaces here and I liked it. And then I thought, wow, it'd be sweet to bring this back to my homeland and spin up something for the community. And so we did design a co-working space there. And so I've had a relationship with Steve for many years now. Steve, the founder of ECOMsquare. And when he told me he was doing the same, I was like, yeah, sweet, let's go. So yeah, I was involved early just in, chatting about what should be what's good, what's bad, what we like about it, because I've done that before.
Mm.
But I mean, nothing nearly as nice as what you guys have created at ECOMsquare. It's a really nice space. I like the blend of, focused working area and casual hangout area. It's often challenging to have both spaces or both kinds of space. They're both necessary. You need to be able to take a casual call or have lunch or whatever without disrupting the people around you. And some more open environments, which, open office workspace was all the rage for a while there. But you still need some disconnect between quiet, focused area and loud, do whatever you want area.
Yeah.
So ECOMsquare has been good for that. I like the events you guys have been running. I've attended a few, and the cycling meetup is great. Like, it's a good community.
Cool. Yeah, that's something that I talked to Mike Trujillo, and he mentioned as well the space. I thought that he was really loved just being in the space, which is all credit to Steve and Steve's brother and his family who put it together.
Yeah, getting out of your home is underrated, and I take it for granted sometimes how nice it is to be around other people who are moving the needle, like digging into hard problems. I think having a space, we've swung the pendulum so far from office to home over COVID. And now I love and appreciate a third space that's neither, that is a place of productivity. It's probably what libraries were like 20 years ago, honestly.
Yeah.
But now everybody's got a laptop, so there's other amenities that you need that a library doesn't really enable, like coffee.
Yep. Yeah, that's big. It's really cool though. And have you had a lot of chance to sort of mix and mingle with the other people there? What kind of people are you around when you're working there at ECOMsquare?
A few. Honestly, I'm a father of young daughters and a business owner, and a lot of my time that I spend in ECOMsquare is plugged in, and I go there for the focus. I for sure have met some interesting folks though, and it's been fun to get to know the community. But yeah, I mean, I'm not the most personable when I'm in work mode.
Okay. Yeah.
I try my best to be nice, and there's a fine line. If I'm downstairs, you have good conversations. If I'm upstairs, I'm like, I need my headphones on.
Yeah. Okay.
And
Well,
I
that's cool.
appreciate that you
That's
get
good.
both.
It's yeah, exactly what I was gonna say. That's cool that you can get both. Is there anything else that you kind of wanted to speak about in either SpeedSense or web performance? Anything that people you're excited about?
I think the only other thing I'd like to add is, there's a with every practice you can chase the numbers, you can try and get greens and 100% scores and all this stuff, and we've gamified our lives. But what we do is less about the best Google rank or 100% score, and it's more about delivering an experience that is great for your users. So not only minimize frustration, but if you can instill delight in some way. And so I guess a little bit, I'm still playing with how far do we want to constrain our services to just site speed, and there's a fine line between that and user experience. The two are inextricable, right? And so we'll often get discussions around how should we transition from cart to checkout, and where should we do authentication, and the flow of shopping in general. And there's space there for expertise that, I mean, we haven't necessarily become. I'm not positioning SpeedSense as an e-commerce UX consultancy by any means, but for sure site speed and UX are tightly correlated. So I don't know if you're considering the path, the journey of the user with your brand in general, inside or outside of your website, then performance is part of that. But there's also a lot of other parts of that.
Certainly. And I think, yeah, I mean, every marketer knows that the user persona, the user journey, the user experience is key at every stage of their interaction with your brand. So I do think if you do have an e-commerce store, obviously if you have performance issues or you're wondering about performance issues, then SpeedSense would be a great place to go for that. And also you'll be in touch with, smart, talented people who have a perspective on user experience through the performance lens. And it might not be strictly performance and metrics that gives them insight to, or gives Shawn and his team like a perspective into. It's like they have their unique lens that they're going to see the user experience, and that can give you ideas and lessons and experiments beyond just hitting a number or loading a page and stuff like that.
Yeah, it's a values play, I would say. Like, for example, we had a client recently who has a video on their product detail page, and the video is continuously loading in the background. So it would reload and reload as it played and cycled. And it wasn't going to make their numbers any better for Google because it doesn't, like, first contentful paint, input delay, none of those things are affected by this, but it was essentially causing infinite bandwidth to be used by their customers. And that's not really something that they were okay with, or we were okay in allowing, right? Or, they can do what they want, but our recommendation was, this isn't good for anybody. This isn't good for the planet. Like,
yeah.
This is right. CO2 emissions of infinite page load sizes. And so, yeah, to your point, it's more about values than about speed. And it's more about delivering a good experience than numbers.
Fantastic. Yeah. So thanks again, Shawn, for joining me today. To anyone listening or watching, I hope you learned a lot. If you have more questions, obviously don't hesitate to reach out to Shawn. You can find his company at speedsense.com. If you want to be working side by side by him and leaving him alone while he has his headphones on, then you can check out ecomsquare.co for your e-commerce specific co-working space and community needs. So yeah, thank you again for joining us. Like and subscribe if you liked it, and see you guys in the next one. All right.
Thanks, man.